You've spent your whole life building walls around yourself, but what if I told you? The thing you're guarding so carefully is the very thing keeping you trapped. There's a version of you that you carry everywhere. It walks into rooms before you do. It speaks before you've thought. It decides what's safe and what's dangerous, what's acceptable and what must be hidden. This version of you has a name. You call it me. You've been protecting it for so long, you don't even remember when the guarding began. Maybe it started in childhood, when someone laughed at your drawing. Maybe it began the first time you felt shame for wanting something you weren't supposed to want. Or perhaps it was that quiet moment when you realized the world expected you to be a certain way, and you decided somewhere deep inside that you would meet that expectation, even if it meant burying parts of yourself in the process. And so you built the armor, piece by piece, reaction by reaction. You learned which mask to wear at work, which smile to give at family gatherings, which version of your story to tell when someone asks how you're doing. You became an expert at maintenance, at upkeep, at reinforcing the walls whenever someone got too close. You learned to deflect compliments because accepting them might crack the image. You learned to avoid certain conversations because they might reveal the parts you've worked so hard to conceal. You became vigilant, constantly scanning for threats to this carefully constructed identity. But here's what no one tells you. The self you're protecting isn't really you. It's a ghost, a collection of old fears, past wounds, and inherited beliefs about who you're supposed to be. It's built from the judgments of people who barely knew themselves. It's assembled from moments of pain that you decided defined you. And the tragedy, the quiet, exhausting tragedy, is that you've been sacrificing your real life to keep this ghost alive. Think about it. How much energy do you spend each day maintaining an image? How often do you bite your tongue because speaking your truth might disrupt the persona? How many experiences have you avoided because they didn't fit the story you tell yourself about who you are? The version of you that needs constant protection is the version that believes it's not enough. It's the self that thinks it must earn love through performance. It's the identity that's convinced it will be abandoned if it shows its true face. So you guard it fiercely. You become its defender, its lawyer, its PR team. When someone criticizes you, you don't just hear their words, you hear a threat to your entire constructed self. When someone disagrees with your opinion, you don't just have a different perspective, you feel attacked at your core. This is why arguments become battles. Why feedback feels like assault. Why vulnerability seems like suicide. Because you're not defending an idea or a position. You're defending the fortress. And fortresses, by design, are built for war. But here's the truth that changes everything. The self that needs protection is the self that causes your suffering. Let that sit for a moment. Every time you feel anxious about what others think, that's the protected self demanding maintenance. Every time you feel the sting of rejection, that's the fortress registering a breach. Every time you can't sleep because you replayed a conversation, analyzing your performance, that's the ghost requiring attention. The Sufis have a teaching about this. They call it nafs, the ego, self, the constructed identity that believes it's separate from everything else. This nafs is like a demanding child. It needs constant validation, constant proof of its existence. constant protection from anything that might threaten its story. And your true self, the awareness beneath all the construction, you've been conscripted into service. You've become the bodyguard for a tyrant that was never real to begin with. Here's what's happening. You're experiencing two types of pain. There's the original pain, the natural discomfort of being human, the sadness of loss, the uncertainty of not knowing, the vulnerability of being alive in a world you can't control. This pain is real, but it's also clean. It passes through you like weather. Then there's the second pain, the pain of protecting yourself from the first pain. This is the suffering you create by resisting, by defending, by maintaining the walls. This is the exhaustion of pretending, the anxiety of keeping up appearances, the loneliness of hiding your true self. The first pain is inevitable. The second pain is optional. And almost all of your suffering lives in the second category. When Alan Watts spoke about the ego, he said it's like a knot that's trying to untie itself using itself. You cannot use the protected self to free yourself from the protected self. You cannot think your way out of a problem created by thinking. The self you're protecting is hurting you because it demands that you live in constant fear. Fear of exposure, fear of failure, fear of not being enough. It turns every interaction into an evaluation, every relationship into a transaction, every moment into a performance. And the cruelest part, the thing you're protecting doesn't even exist in the way you think it does. Who you really are isn't a fixed thing that needs guarding. You're not a sculpture that might chip. You're not a house that might crumble. You're more like water, like sky, like the space in which all things appear and disappear. Today, notice when you're in protection mode. It usually feels like tightness, like holding your breath, like rehearsing words before you speak them, like calculating how you'll be perceived before you act. In those moments, ask yourself, what am I protecting right now? Not in your head, in your body. Where do you feel the defense? Is it in your chest, your throat, your stomach? And then ask the deeper question, who would I be without this defense? What would happen if I lowered the shield just for a moment? You don't have to change anything. Just notice. Just observe. Because awareness itself begins to dissolve the walls you didn't know you were building. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being your own prison guard. You might not name it that way, you call it stress, or anxiety, or just how life is. But underneath all those words is a simple truth. You're tired of maintaining a version of yourself that requires constant surveillance. Think of the last time you were truly relaxed, not distracted, not numbed by entertainment, but genuinely at ease. For most people, it's harder to remember than it should be, because ease requires dropping the armor, and you've been wearing it for so long, it feels like skin. The armor has many forms. Sometimes it's perfectionism, the belief that if you just get everything right, you'll finally be safe. Sometimes it's people pleasing, the conviction that your value comes from others' approval. Sometimes it's cynicism, the protective layer of not caring so you can't be disappointed. Sometimes it's achievement, the endless pursuit of external validation to prove you're worthy. But whatever form it takes, the armor shares one quality: it's heavy. And you're the one carrying it. The price of protection. Here's what happens when you live in protection mode. You stop experiencing life directly. Everything gets filtered through the question, how does this affect me? How does this make me look? What does this mean for the story I tell about myself? You're at a party, but you're not really there. You're monitoring. You're performing. You're calculating whether you're being interesting enough, likable enough, successful enough. You're comparing your insides to everyone else's outsides, running a constant background program of evaluation and judgment. Someone shares good news, and your first internal response isn't joy, it's comparison. Why haven't I achieved that? A friend is vulnerable with you, and instead of simply being present, you're already thinking about what you'll share to match their vulnerability, to maintain the balance, to protect your position in the relationship. This is the tyranny of self-protection. It turns every moment into a transaction about you. The Buddhists call this dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately described as unsatisfactoriness. The way nothing quite hits when you're always one step removed, always protecting, always maintaining the constructed self. You could be standing before the most beautiful sunset, but you're thinking about how to photograph it, how to describe it later, whether you're appreciating it correctly. You could be in an intimate conversation, but you're preparing your next words instead of listening. You could be exactly where you've always wanted to be, but you can't feel it because you're too busy protecting the story of who you think you should be. The paradox of vulnerability. Here's something strange. The moments you remember most fondly, the experiences that felt most alive, were almost always moments when the armor fell away. Think about it. That conversation that went until 3 a.m., that time you laughed until you cried, that moment of connection when you said the risky true thing and someone really saw you, that experience when you were so absorbed in what you were doing that you forgot to monitor yourself. In those moments, you weren't protecting, you were present. The constructed self wasn't running the show, and paradoxically, that's when you felt most yourself. This is the great cosmic joke. The thing you're trying so hard to protect is preventing you from experiencing the very thing that would make you feel whole. You protect yourself to feel safe, but the protection creates loneliness. You maintain the image to be loved, but the image prevents real intimacy. You guard your vulnerability to avoid pain, but the guarding creates numbness. The Sufi poet Rumi understood this. He wrote, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." The barriers are the protected self. Every defense mechanism, every should and must and have to, that isn't truly yours. Every mask you put on in the morning, every truth you swallow to keep the peace, every part of yourself you hide because you learned it wasn't acceptable. The invisible cage. Most people don't realize they're in a cage until they bump against the bars. You might feel free, you make choices, you have preferences, you live your life. But then something happens. Someone asks you what you really want, and you realize you don't know. You're presented with an opportunity that excites you, but you can't take it because it doesn't fit your story. You feel a flash of your true self, but you quickly suppress it because it's not safe. That's the cage, built from old beliefs, reinforced by fear, maintained by habit. The tragedy isn't that the cage exists, most people live in one. The tragedy is that you're both the prisoner and the jailer. You lock yourself in, and you defend the lock. You forget that you're the one holding the key. This week, pay attention to the word should every time you think, I should do this, or I shouldn't feel that. Pause. Ask yourself, who says, where did this rule come from? Is it actually mine, or did I inherit it? Notice the difference between genuine preference and protective behavior. Genuine preference feels light, even if it's a no. Protective behavior feels heavy, obligatory, defended. Start recognizing the texture of protection. It often feels like bracing, like holding, like managing. It's the opposite of flow. And here's a radical practice just for one day. Give yourself permission to be unimpressive, to be ordinary, to not have the right opinion or the clever response, to exist without earning your existence. See what happens when you're not constantly defending the fortress. The breaking point. There usually comes a moment, sometimes quiet, sometimes catastrophic, when the old way stops working. Maybe it's a loss that cracks you open. Maybe it's an achievement that feels hollow. Maybe it's just the slow accumulation of years spent performing, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize yourself. The Zen masters call this hitting the wall, the dark night of the soul, the place where all your strategies fail, where the armor becomes too heavy to carry, where the protected self finally exhausts you. This moment feels like death, and in a way it is. Not the death of you, but the death of the false you. The death of the ghost you've been animating with your life force. Most people run from this moment. They find new strategies, new defenses, new ways to reinforce the walls. They change jobs, change partners, change cities, anything to avoid the fundamental confrontation with the self they've been protecting. But some people don't run. Some people stop. They sit in the rubble of their constructed identity and ask the dangerous question, who am I without all of this? The space between, when you begin to release the protected self, there's a strange period of disorientation. You've spent so long being a certain way that not being that way feels like falling. You've used certain patterns to navigate the world, approval seeking, achievement, control, performance, and without them, you don't know how to move. This is normal. You're learning to walk without crutches you didn't know you were using. In this space, you might feel vulnerable in a way you've never felt before. Not the vulnerability you've been avoiding, the one where people might judge you or reject you, but a deeper vulnerability. The recognition that you never needed protection in the first place. You're vulnerable because you're real. You're exposed because you're honest. You're undefended because you're finally trusting life instead of fighting it. Here's what starts to happen. Things that used to devastate you begin to pass through you. Criticism doesn't stick the same way. Rejection hurts, but it doesn't define you. Failure happens, but it doesn't become your identity. Because you're not protecting a fixed self anymore. There's nothing rigid to break. You're becoming like bamboo, flexible, rooted, but able to bend with the wind. The true self, people often ask, if I'm not the protected self, then who am I? And the answer is both simple and impossible to put into words. You are the awareness that notices the protected self. You are not your thoughts, you are the space in which thoughts arise. You are not your emotions, you are the presence that experiences emotions. You are not your story, you are the consciousness that witnesses the story. The Upanishads describe this as Atman, the true self, the witness, the unchanging awareness beneath all the changing forms. It's what was there before you learned your name. It's what remains when all the identities fall away. This isn't abstract philosophy. You can taste this in direct experience. Have you ever had a moment where you caught yourself in a pattern and just stopped? Where you watched your mind spinning its familiar story and recognized with sudden clarity that you don't have to believe it. In that moment of recognition, where were you? You weren't in the pattern. You were observing it. That observer, that aware presence is closer to your true nature than any identity you've constructed. The beautiful thing about this true self is that it doesn't need protection. It can't be threatened because it isn't a thing. It can't be destroyed because it was never constructed. It can't be judged because it has no fixed form. This is what spiritual traditions point to when they talk about liberation, enlightenment, awakening. Not becoming someone better or more spiritual, but recognizing what you already are beneath all the protection. Living undefended. When you begin to live from this place, life doesn't become perfect. You still feel pain, experience loss, face uncertainty. But the quality of your experience shifts. You're no longer constantly scanning for threats to your identity because you're not identified with a fixed self. You're no longer exhausted by maintenance because there's nothing to maintain. You're no longer lonely in crowds because you're not hiding behind a persona. Relationships transform. Instead of performing for approval, you're simply present. Instead of managing how you're perceived, you're genuinely curious about the other person. Intimacy becomes possible because there's no wall between you and the world. Creativity flows more easily because you're not filtering everything through. Will this make me look good? You try things. You fail. You try again. Not because you're building a narrative of resilience, but because there's no heavy self to be embarrassed. Decisions become clearer because you're not constantly checking them against the question, what will people think? You develop an internal compass that feels true, not because it's always right, but because it's actually yours. Here's a practice that can shift everything. Stop defending yourself. Just for today, when someone criticizes you or misunderstands you or judges you, don't explain, don't correct, don't justify. Notice what happens in your body. Notice the urge to fix their perception. Notice how much energy you normally spend managing other people's opinions of you. And then let it go. Let them think whatever they think. Let them be wrong about you if they're wrong about you. See if you can survive not controlling the narrative. This isn't about being passive or accepting mistreatment. It's about recognizing that their opinion of you is not an emergency. Your true self doesn't need their validation. Try this sit quietly and ask yourself, what am I? Don't answer with your roles, your achievements, your characteristics. Just sit with the question. Notice the awareness that's asking. Notice the space in which the question arises. That spacious awareness that's closer to home than any protected self could ever be. After the walls fall, when you stop protecting the false self, you don't disappear. You don't become passive or empty. You don't lose your preferences or personality or the things that make you unique. What happens is simpler and more profound. You become available to life, available to be moved, available to be surprised, available to change your mind, available to connect deeply, available to fail without collapsing, available to succeed without clinging. You discover that the self beneath the protected self is far more resilient than you imagined. Not because it's strong in the way you thought strength worked, rigid, defended, invulnerable, but because it's fluid, adaptive, spacious enough to hold both joy and grief without breaking. The ancient Taoists understood this. They spoke of Wu Wei, effortless action, the way water moves through the world. Water doesn't protect itself. It doesn't maintain an image. It simply responds to what's in front of it, taking the shape of whatever container it meets, yet always remaining itself. This is what becomes possible. When you release the armor, you move through life with water's grace. You can be soft without being weak. You can be open without being naive. You can be vulnerable without being broken. The new relationship with pain. One of the most surprising discoveries is how your relationship with pain transforms. You spent so much energy trying to avoid suffering, building walls, maintaining stories, protecting the constructed self because you believed pain would destroy you. But when you stop protecting, you find that pain is just pain. It hurts, yes. It's uncomfortable. But it's also temporary. It moves through you like clouds moving through sky, leaving the sky unchanged. You cry, and the tears don't mean you're broken. You fail, and the failure doesn't define you. You're rejected, and you remain whole. You feel grief, and underneath the grief, there's something vast and unshaken. This doesn't mean you become cold or detached. If anything, you feel more. But you feel cleanly, directly, without the second layer of suffering that comes from protecting yourself from the first layer. You develop what the Buddhists call equanimity, not the absence of feeling, but the capacity to be with whatever arises without losing yourself in it. Living from the inside out. When you're no longer preoccupied with maintaining a protected self, something remarkable happens. You start living from the inside out instead of the outside in. Before, you were constantly checking external signals. What do they think? How am I doing? Am I good enough? Your sense of self was assembled from reflected judgments, like building a sculpture from broken mirrors. Now there's an internal reference point, not an ego screaming for validation, but a quiet knowing. A sense of rightness that doesn't require external confirmation. You know when something aligns with your truth because you feel it in your body, a kind of inner yes. You know when something's off because there's a subtle contraction, a dimming of your light. This doesn't mean you ignore others or stop caring about impact. But you stop needing everyone to validate your existence. You stop collapsing when someone disagrees. You stop betraying yourself to maintain harmony. You become, in the truest sense, your own authority, not because you're arrogant, but because you've stopped outsourcing your okayness. The paradox of freedom. Here's the final paradox. When you stop trying to control how you're perceived, when you release the exhausting work of self-protection, you often become more effective in the world, not less, because you're no longer wasting energy on impression management. That energy becomes available for actual creation, actual connection, actual living. Because you're not performing a pre-scripted role, you can respond freshly to what each moment actually requires. Your presence becomes more magnetic, not because you're trying to attract, but because there's a realness to you that people rarely encounter. In a world of carefully curated personas, authenticity is magnetic. Your work improves because you're not filtering everything through. Will this make me look smart? You can take risks, explore, fail, learn. You can admit when you don't know. You can collaborate without competition because someone else's success isn't a threat to your worth. Your relationships deepen because intimacy becomes possible. When you're not hiding, people can actually see you. When you're not defending, people can actually reach you. When you're not performing, genuine connection can happen. The gentle invitation. So this is the invitation, not a demand, not a should, just an offering. What if you tried, just for today, to live undefended? What if you showed up without the armor? What if you spoke without rehearsing? What if you allowed yourself to be seen, not as the polished version you've crafted, but as the messy, imperfect, gloriously human person you actually are? What if you trusted that your okayness doesn't depend on getting it right, on being impressive, on maintaining the walls? You might find that the thing you were protecting all along, the constructed self, the curated image, the defended position, was never worth protecting, because it was never really you. And the you beneath all that protection, that one doesn't need defending. That one is already whole, already enough, already home. The self you've been protecting is the one hurting you, not because it's bad, but because it was never real. It was a response to fear, built over time, maintained at great cost. Underneath it, you've always been free. You just forgot. You got so good at being the guard that you forgot you were also the prisoner. You got so invested in the fortress that you forgot the vast, open sky beyond the walls. The walls can come down now, not all at once, that would be too much, but brick by brick, breath by breath, moment by moment. And when they do, you won't find emptiness. You'll find what was always there, waiting patiently beneath the protection, the simple, undeniable, undefended truth of who you are, vast, present, aware, alive, and finally free.